By the middle of 1943, the tide of the Second World War was turning decisively in favor of the Allies. In January, the Red Army crushed German resistance at Stalingrad, taking more than 70,000 prisoners. In May, British and American forces completed the job of driving the German and Italian armies out of North Africa. While in the Pacific, American forces had driven the Japanese off Guadalcanal and were pushing forward in the Solomon Islands. Amid these dramatic events, the British colony of the Bahamas was very much a backwater. Yet in the stormy early hours of the 8th of July, 1943, its peace was to be shattered. At this palatial house, the body of Sir Harry Oakes, the colony's richest citizen, was found by his friend Harold Christie, who had been staying the night. Christie had walked from his bedroom 2 doors away down the veranda to wake Sir Harry for breakfast. He found Sir Harry's half-burned body lying on the bed with a bloody wound on his head. After contacting the police, Christie rang the governor's mansion to tell one of Oakes' most influential friends the horrific news. This was the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, who had abdicated in 1936 after insisting that he must marry twice-divorced Wallis Simpson. He was now serving as governor of the Bahamas. The Duke told Christie to keep the news secret, but it was already too late. Soon it was on front pages all over the world. When the police and doctor arrived, they found that the body, bedclothes, and curtains had been splashed with petrol and set alight. But high winds during the night had blown the flames out before they could get a proper hold. The room was in disorder, and a pillow had been ripped open and feathers scattered over the body. Sir Harry's head was untouched by the fire, and just above the left ear was a wound with 4 distinct puncture marks. Blood from this had dried upwards over the cheeks and nose, proving that Sir Harry must have been moved after he was attacked. There was a bloody handprint on one wall, and an ornate Chinese lacquer screen near the bed was smeared with blood and fingerprints. The inner hall and staircase were covered with blood and sand, and seemed to have the footprints of several different men on them. After talking to the local police chief, the Duke of Windsor announced that he would be calling in outside help, surprisingly not from a British force, but from the United States. At 10 to 11, the Duke rang the chief of police in Miami and asked specifically for Captain Edward Melcham, a detective who had acted as his bodyguard during holidays in Florida. The Duke also asked by name for Captain James Barker, who was a fingerprint expert. The 2 detectives caught the midday flight from Miami and reached Westbourne at 2 in the afternoon. There, they took charge of the case, with Barker announcing that no fingerprints could be taken that day since the weather was too humid. The detectives seemed surprisingly uninterested in the footprints which had been found on the stairs. They did not request a search of the grounds and seemed to attach little importance to finding and questioning the 2 night watchmen who had disappeared. When a post-mortem showed that Sir Harry's stomach contained an amount of black viscous liquid, they did not feel it necessary to get a detailed analysis. Instead, they asked everyone close to Sir Harry Oakes to come to the mansion to be questioned. The murdered man was not a native Bahamian. He had been born in the United States in 1875, in Sangerville, Maine. His family was prosperous, and he had originally intended to become a doctor. But in his 20s, Oakes had become obsessed with gold prospecting and borrowed money from his family to join the gold rush in the Klondike. For the next 15 years, Harry Oakes roamed the world, prospecting in Australia and California before striking lucky in northern Canada. Encouraged by a small strike near the Ontario town of Swastika, he bought land on the edge of Kirkland Lake. There he found a seam of gold some 40 foot thick and miles long. By 1921, Oakes's Lakeshore mine was in full production, making him one of the richest men in the world. The lonely years as a struggling prospector had made Oakes an abrupt and gruff person, but he could be enormously generous with his wealth. During a world cruise, he met and married an Australian girl. They soon had 5 children. Oakes objected to paying Canada's heavy taxes. A chance meeting with Harold Christie, one of the leading Bahamian property developers, persuaded him to move to the British colony, where tax rates were negligible. He soon gained a reputation throughout the Bahamas for his generosity, funding educational and health schemes for the poor. As a Bahamian citizen, Oakes now plunged into pre-war British society, giving massively to charities. Shortly before the Second World War, this generosity led to him being created a baronet. Sir Harry earned his adopted empire's further gratitude by funding 3 Spitfires, which fought in the Battle of Britain. Sir Harry Oakes was inevitably one of the leading figures with whom the Duke of Windsor came into contact when he arrived in the Bahamas in 1941 as governor. Britain's former king had found that life as an ex-monarch was not easy. The woman he loved and for whom he had sacrificed his throne was turning out to have been as much interested in his job as his devotion. At one point during the constitutional crisis, she had been heard to remark, "Anything would be better than abdication." Once the worst had happened, she diverted herself with massively extravagant shopping sprees. Her husband also earned considerable bad publicity by visiting Nazi Germany and showing open approval for the activities of Hitler's government. When the war started, the Duke did his best to support the Allied war effort, acting as a sort of unofficial ambassador to the French. Forced to flee to Portugal by the fall of France, the Duke reluctantly accepted Winston Churchill's offer of the governorship of the Bahamas. The royal couple arrived in Nassau in August 1940. They regarded the place as a dump and barely concealed their boredom. At that time, the Bahamas had not become the cosmopolitan playground they are today. Power was tightly controlled by a small group of wealthy white businessmen, among them Harold Christie, known as the Bay Street Boys, after Nassau's main street where most of them had their offices. The Duke and Duchess despised most of the people they were forced to mix with. But Sir Harry Oakes was not one of these. For the Duke, like his grandfather, Edward VII, was fascinated by the company of self-made men. The two men began to see each other regularly, and the Duke was very sympathetic when Sir Harry heard that his 19-year-old daughter Nancy had got engaged to a twice-divorced French Mauritian named Count Freddy de Marigny. De Marigny and his closest friend, Marquis Georges de Vidalou, had arrived in the Bahamas shortly before the Second World War. De Marigny had moved from Mauritius to London, where he had lived high, successfully selling shares and marrying a banker's daughter. When she fell for de Vidaloo, he had agreed to an amicable divorce, and the three of them set off aboard the luxury liner Normandie to try their luck in New York. Once there, de Marigny again proved his financial skills as a stockbroker, while his charm soon captivated the daughter of one of his senior partner's wealthy relatives. During their honeymoon, the couple fell in love with the Bahamas and went to live on Eleuthera. Shortly after the war broke out, they got amicably divorced for tax reasons. Tall, dark, handsome, and enormously attractive to women, de Marigny soon became a leader of the island's younger and faster social set. He was an excellent sailor, and his yacht Concubine won many of the Caribbean's major trophies. But more traditional Bahamas society hated de Marigny for his arrogance. They regarded him as a foreigner, a dangerous womanizer, and a cad. De Marigny also fell out with the Duke of Windsor and made no secret of his contempt for the man he described as "not my favorite ex-king." So there was considerable scandal when Nancy Oakes revealed that she and de Marigny were not just engaged, but had got secretly married in New York. At first, Sir Harry seemed to be ready to make the best of it. He admired his new son-in-law's business acumen and independent-mindedness. But shortly before Sir Harry's death, it became known that the two had quarrelled over de Marigny's refusal to attend a cocktail party given by the Duke. There were rumours that de Marigny had threatened to crack his father-in-law's head. De Marigny was among those called to Westbourne on the afternoon of Sir Harry Oakes' death by Melchon and Barker, and they paid him particular attention. He told them that he and de Vidaloo had been at a dinner party the previous night. He had driven two of the guests home at about 1 o'clock. He acknowledged that his route home would have taken him past Westbourne. De Vidaloo confirmed this, revealing that he had seen de Marigny again at about 3 o'clock after driving another guest, Betty Roberts, home. He had gone to his friend's room to collect his pet cat, which had gone to sleep with him. Harold Christie described how he and two other friends had dined with Sir Harry at Westbourne. The other guests had left at about 11, and he had gone to bed shortly afterwards. The night had been stormy, and, despite only being a few yards down the veranda, he had heard nothing. Detectives Barker and Melchon returned to de Marigny's statement, asking him to show them the clothes he had been wearing. His suit had already been cleaned, and he couldn't remember which shirt he had had on. The next morning, the two Miami detectives took fingerprints. De Marigny was asked back to the house for questioning. He was taken upstairs and into the bedroom. At various times while there, Melchon asked him for a glass of water and threw him a packet of cigarettes. At 7:30 that evening, de Marigny was astonished to be arrested and charged with the murder. After revealing further details about the killing, the detectives flew to see Lady Oakes in the United States, where she was on holiday. They gave her a graphic and gory account of how de Marigny had beaten her husband unconscious and then finished off the job by dousing him with petrol and burning him alive. Nancy alone stood by her husband. She hired a well-known American private investigator, Raymond Schindler, and sent him to Nassau. Once there, Schindler soon found that strange things started happening. He arrived at Westbourne to find the police scrubbing away all fingerprints, bloodstains, and footprints. They refused to let him examine any that remained. Then he heard rumors of strange landings from a motor launch on the night of the crime. The eyewitness he contacted was suddenly drowned. Schindler's phone was tapped, and he was followed. Anyone he spoke to was interrogated by the police. The Bahamas police chief, Erskine Lindop, who had been openly critical of the Miami detectives, suddenly found himself promoted to be Assistant Chief of Police in Trinidad and sent away immediately. A message sent by de Marigny to the leading Nassau barrister Alfred Adderley, asking him to lead his defense, never reached Adderley. He was briefed to appear for the prosecution. When de Marigny appeared for committal, the most critical piece of evidence against him was a single, clean fingerprint which Barker claimed to have found on the Chinese screen shortly after his arrival. Barker claimed that de Marigny had not been taken up to the bedroom until later that afternoon, so the print must have been placed there earlier. Even ignoring the fact that Barker had apparently refused to collect any prints that afternoon because it was too muggy, de Marigny was able to show that he had been in the bedroom in the company of the police that morning, long before Barker had even arrived on the island. De Marigny stated that he had hurried to his father-in-law's house as soon as he had heard of the murder, and had gone upstairs in the company of Chief of Police Erskine Lindop. It was unfortunate that Erskine Lindop would not be able to be present at de Marigny's trial to corroborate that he had accompanied him to the murdered man's bedroom. Freddie de Marigny's trial began on the 18th of October 1943 in the Bahamas Supreme Court in Bay Street, Nassau. From early morning, there were queues waiting to get into the spectators' seats, mostly servants carrying cushions to reserve places for their masters. The relaxed-looking de Marigny was brought from Nassau's main jail. It was noted that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who had only just returned from an 8-week holiday in the United States, now found it necessary to return there for the duration of the trial. The presiding judge was Sir Oscar Daly, Chief Justice of the Bahamas. His procedure of writing down every word of evidence in a black ledger meant that the trial proceeded at a stately pace. De Marigny had persuaded another leading Bahamas barrister, Godfrey Higgs, to lead his defense. He worked closely with Raymond Schindler. The prosecution was led by the Bahamas Attorney General, Eric Hallinan, with Alfred Adderley in support. The prosecution began by claiming that de Marigny had hated his father-in-law and had murdered him to get hold of the wealth his wife would one day inherit. However, once the prosecution moved on to the events of the night of the murder, its case began to look somewhat threadbare. Harold Christie soon lost his air of confidence when his claim that he had gone to bed at 11 o'clock was contradicted by testimony from Captain Edward Sears, a senior traffic policeman who stated that he had seen Christie being driven down Bay Street at midnight. It had been raining, so Sears had been unable to see who else had been in the car. Christie could only repeat his testimony and insist that Sears, who knew him well, must be mistaken. The Miami detectives were not called until the second week. Then Melchin caused a sensation when he admitted under defense cross-examination that Barker had not told him about the discovery of the vital fingerprint on the Chinese screen for more than a week. When Barker was called, he was forced to admit that he had no proof that the fingerprint had actually come off the screen, since he had forgotten to bring his fingerprint camera to record it in position. The defense produced a series of specimens showing that any fingerprint lifted off the screen would inevitably have been much less clear than the print produced by Barker. Instead of following standard police procedure of dusting every print and photographing it in position before being witnessed, lifting it off with transparent tape, Barker had succeeded in destroying all but one of them. He could not refute the defense suggestion that this one could easily have come from the glass or cigarette packet that de Marigny had handled while being interrogated. Nor could Barker explain why he had not examined any of the bloodstains, the footprints, or the bloody handprint, and had allowed them to be destroyed without proper records being made. When the defense began its case, much was made of these lapses, and the total lack of evidence, other than one dubious fingerprint, that de Marigny had gone to Westbourne that evening. His alibi remained solid, with de Vidalou adamant that he had spoken to his friend both at 1 o'clock, when de Marigny left the dinner party, and at 3 o'clock, when he had retrieved his cat from de Marigny's bedroom. The trial lasted for 3 weeks, during which public opinion swung more and more onto de Marigny's side. When on the 11th of November Sir Oscar Daly came to sum up for the jury, he was scathing about the incompetence of the Miami detectives, calling Barker's performance incredible, with his failure to take fingerprints properly and to follow up all the other evidence. The jury retired on the afternoon of the 12th of November. They were back in an hour and a half and found de Marigny not guilty by a 9-3 majority. A jubilant de Marigny left the court, but his freedom was severely limited, for the jury had taken the unusual step of recommending that both he and de Vidalou should be deported immediately. The Duke of Windsor was particularly keen that this should happen, and was infuriated when he got back after the trial to find that de Marigny was still in the Bahamas. When the United States refused de Marigny a visa, he slipped away to Cuba, almost penniless after his massive legal bills. He was to spend the rest of his life as a penniless wanderer, since Nancy left him in 1944 to return to the United States. Little was done subsequently to reopen the case of her father's murder, and it remains officially unsolved. But soon rumors were circulating which could account for the high-level cover-up and framing of an obviously innocent man which began on that stormy night in 1943. When James Barker was shot accidentally by his own son 2 years later, it emerged that he had long been working for the mafia. Organized crime had first become interested in the Bahamas during Prohibition in the 1920s, and the islands were a natural jumping-off point for running contraband liquor into the United States. Crime chiefs such as Meyer Lansky, who later took control of gambling in nearby Cuba, are believed to have also targeted the Bahamas. His interest coincided with that of some of the Bay Street boys, among them Harold Christie, who were determined to make the islands one of the world's gambling and tourist capitals. The only snag was that gambling was forbidden on the islands, and the majority of the Bahamas executive, led by Sir Harry Oakes, were determined to keep it that way. But rumors abounded that Oakes, Christie, and even the Duke of Windsor had not been over-scrupulous in sending cash abroad from the islands in breach of the wartime British currency regulations. Aware of this, the mafia may have been putting pressure on Sir Harry Oakes to get him to change his mind. It is suggested that at a meeting that evening to which he was taken by Harold Christie, Sir Harry was killed either accidentally or deliberately by a blow to the head. His body was brought back to his house, where attempts to make the killing look like a robbery or accidental fire were botched. Incriminating evidence remained. Freddie de Marigny was selected as a scapegoat to cover up the possibility that the currency smuggling activities of some of the most powerful men in the Bahamas might come to light.